Let's move now and turn our attention to the act of forgetting. I'm a pretty forgetful person, I'll admit it. But why is it that we forget? And when people study forgetting, they kind of define forgetting in several ways. The most obvious one is if you just cannot remember something, right? But there's also other variations of forgetting. For example, if there's distortion and bias into your memory, when you distort your memory, that means you kind of change it somehow. When it's interfered by a different kind of memory, when you forget where you got that memory, there's like a source amnesia. And we're going to talk about a couple of them. So basically, in understanding memory as a function of encoding, storage, and retrieval, that means at every stage of this process, you can experience failure that leads to forgetting. The most obvious one is encoding failure, which is you forget because you didn't really encode it properly. So if you didn't really process something really deeply, when you look at the levels of processing information, if you don't process something too deeply, it doesn't get encoded correctly into your memory. In that case, you don't remember it because you just never remembered it in the first place, right? The second one is the storage decay. This is the basically idea that our brain is only so limited, it's really just a biological thing. And so there's some decay that experiences. And I want to talk about the studies by Ebbinghaus. He did a lot of like these introspective studies where he forced himself to remember lists of random words. Basically just sat there and just remembered words every day. And he kind of looked at how often the next day he would come and try to recall the list of words and see how many he remembers. And the rate of forgetting is pretty high. Basically by day 5, people forget most of what they've learned. About half of it is gone. So our brain is only so limited in terms of remembering these random letters like CHJ, KTU. And they found that by day 5, it kind of plateaus out now. And the things that you do remember, you probably remember the next few days. But the things you forget, they kind of get lost in the first couple days. So when we think about forgetting, we think it's really kind of a decaying in the brain. Things get kind of withered out. And that's kind of a true idea, that after a couple days, your memory just decays. Finally, there's a problem in retrieval. That is when you want to come pick it up, when you're going to get it back again, there's an interference that leads to you not being able to remember that. And I'll give you a couple examples. And there's actually 2 kinds of interference. And this is the idea that things that you've learned interfere with each other. So in the first one, new information interferes with old information. And I'll give you a quick example. So I love learning language, right? So back in college, I took Spanish. And a couple years ago, I took Japanese. And one thing you don't know is that the pronunciation of Japanese and Spanish are actually very similar. And what I found out was that oftentimes when I try to remember the Spanish word, the Japanese words interfered with it, right? So if instead of remember the Spanish word for apple, manzana, I would remember the Japanese word, ringo. And so when I'm trying to speak Spanish, oftentimes I have these Japanese words stuck there. And so that's what we call proactive interference. Learning Japanese later as a new thing interfered with my memory of Spanish. Okay, pretty good. Now it happened the other way around too. That when I was trying to speak Japanese, oftentimes I'd have Spanish words plugged in. And this is the opposite, which is the retroactive interference, where old information interferes with new information. Another example of this might be you're trying to remember someone's phone number, but it's kind of similar to like another friend's phone number you've had long ago, and you just confuse the two. And you can't remember the new one because the old one is still stuck there. And that's kind of retroactive interference. Basically saying when we want to pick up the information to retrieve it, it's interfered by some other memory also in there. And there's also a different kind of forgetting called motivated forgetting. This is the idea that there's something about us that we motivate to forget something. I'll give you a quick example. If people in college, when they're asked to remember their SAT scores, sometimes remember it as higher. They just retrieve it as higher SAT scores. When an adult is asked about their opinion on something from the past, for example, if you'd asked an adult how they felt about abortion a couple years ago, many years ago in their childhood, you find that they actually report their actual number that they report is closer to what they are now than what it was then. So it could be the case that when they were younger, they were more anti-abortion, but now they're more okay with it. But when you ask them, oh, how were you when you were a kid? It's like, oh yeah, I was always pretty pro-abortion all along. And what's motivated there is that sometimes we want to change the way we present ourselves, and the memories help do that. So if you're kind of on a diet and you're trying to remember how much food you ate, you might actually underestimate the number of food you ate. Like, oh, I only ate like 1 cupcake when you actually like stuffed your mouth with 5 cupcakes. And people are motivated to forget because there's certain reasons to do so. Another reason for motivated forgetting is what we call repression. We touched upon this a couple times. It's a very psychoanalytic idea championed by Freud, who thought that sometimes things happen in our childhood or in our adulthood that is so awful, so damaging, that we can't really function unless we forget it. So events like sexual abuse, rape, things like that are so traumatic that our brain helps us out by forgetting those things, purposely repressing them, putting them in the back of our minds so we don't have to think about them all the time. That's a very kind of romantic idea, but I don't think the research really bears that out. But that's the idea of motivated forgetting associated with repression. Okay. So let's talk about memory as a constructive process. And before we talk about that, I'd like to do a quick demonstration with you to see how good your memory is. In a moment, I'm going to list about 10 words, and afterwards I'm going to ask you to remember them back, okay? So here, let's see if we can do the 10. Bed, pillow, sheets, dream, tired, milk, pajamas, night, soporific, and lazy. That's 10 words.